also works on thermoacoustic instability. And most importantly, he is the chairman of the NCCRD, National Center for Combustion Research and Development, which is a joint institute between Chennai and Bangalore. So I requested him to speak a little bit about the initiatives before going into his regular talk. Welcome, Dr. Chakravarti.
The grand challenge areas are essentially in the application sectors like the automotive where we target fuels and low emissions, and in popular combustion, where in India we have this problem of very high content coals, and we have to work with blended fuels and things like blending biomass and coal and stuff. And in the area of aerospace, quite favorite to me is the train stability and train stabilization, which is also thermoacoustic instability. So this basically leads to a big chart of activities that we have been planning the last year or so, with lots of these kinds of workshops going on. And so there is like broadly, you can see the auto, aero, and thermal, which were reflected in the previous slide, but there are also a couple of other heads that are there for fire and fire research and microgravity combustion. So under the auto head, we are essentially trying to do the gasoline direct injection as like one big problem. They group it for, and there's also some electronic control and optical engine activity that goes along with it. In the aerospace head, we have a subgroup of sprays, which is a fairly big group here. And combustion dynamics shows up, and that's like, I could have rewritten this as Sujit, but it doesn't matter. Then we have supersonic combustion and solid propellant combustion, also because of the military and hypersonic vehicle interest in the country there. And in the thermal power sector, we plan to actually have a fairly extensive thermophysical properties and kinetics characterization of a wide range of solid, liquid, and gaseous fuels. And in the system side, we've been looking at burners, furnaces, gasification, gas engines, and carbon sequestration. There are projects that have been identified here, working with industries for specific topics and so on. And on the fire, we have a whole bunch of things again. So one of the most recent things that we have been getting into is underground coal fire. And then microgravity drop cover is one of those things that we are setting up here on this side of this part of the world. So there is like a big list of technologies and rigs that are planned. So some of these rigs will be pretty useful, I think. For example, a high pressure spray rig or a optical gas turbine engine in this context, and supersonic combustor rigs and so on. So there is a couple of these that should probably attract interest from the academic community. The multi-burner interaction rig, as well as a versatile interaction rig for multiple interaction studies like swirl, circle, and spray, and so on. So these are actually have come out of intense discussions that we have had across IIT and IIT across the Ladakh and so on. And so that's just a collage of logos of different industries that we have been talking to. So this space is ever getting crowded here. Now, we have been doing this, what we call as ACRC schools of combustion, which is the continuing education program that we have done. So we've done about 7 schools so far. One of them is actually combustion dynamics that was done in another school about a year ago. And there are 2 upcoming schools that are planned, but then this target is not met because of some funding reasons, but I think we will probably push this to maybe end of 2014. Summer we should actually expect to have more students here. That we could, if we are able to coordinate this better, we can get some textbooks kind of thing going, or edited books. So as far as the infrastructure is concerned, at IIT Madras, we are expecting to have a 5-story building constructed. So this construction is on the way. So if you take a walk on the campus and then get past all the dirty construction sites, you will find one of them being this, with the building superstructure coming somewhere up to here right now. So we are about, the superstructure is about halfway through, and so that should actually get over by about April, and then the remaining months until about the end of July is when they would actually, so they've started building the walls as well. So I think by the end of July we should have more or less the building completed. There are 2 other buildings that are actually nearing completion. One of them is pretty close to the one by the end of this month. So altogether, this will be around 35,000 square feet worth of space, housing like automotive combustion lab, thermal power lab, the computational combustion lab, burner development lab, laser diagnostics lab, fuel characterization lab, spray characterization lab, aerospace lab, combustion lab, and so on. So lots of different combustion-oriented labs will be housed in one building here. by this summer. So that's what I want to just tell you on what's going on here. So let's just get back to the talk that I was supposed to give. So this is again, so coming back to thermoacoustics initially. So what we're trying to do here is to look at the traditional literature on combustion instability in lean physics systems adopted to Reynolds gas turbines for power generation. And it's also, of course, witnessed in afterburners and Brandis and Wegener, with using Wegener body flame holder, something that's of interest to our military gas turbine engines. So we can basically look at canonical geometries into certain expansions, block body and swirl flow. So the general approach is like, we say that water shedding is geometry of a certain expansion or a block body, constantly water shedding, and heat release fluctuations. Then there is equal ratio fluctuations. So I would think that these are like scalar fluctuations similar to enthalpy and entropy fluctuations that affect the plane dynamics, and therefore the heat release fluctuations. So this is the general norm. So everybody seems to understand this up to that point. So what we are trying to do here is to actually synthesize systematic experimental data on comparable size laboratory scale geometries on three canonical plane stabilization structures or constructs like certain expansion, which is the back fitting bigger the block body and swirl flow. And the problem that I had was I started actually assuming that I didn't know any combustion instability, and said let's just vary everything that's possible under the sun, and then see what we will get. And it turned out that people were not doing that with such patience before. So we just varied the combustor length that will, of course, targeting, let's say, the longitudinal gas acoustic modes. So we vary the natural acoustic frequency that mode. Then we have the axial location of the flame holder in the duct, the axial location of the fuel injection at or upstream of the flame holder, airflow rates and fuel flow rates, pretty much recklessly. Sometimes we go very rich as well. The students don't even bother. They just turn the valves and get the data. And then we figure out, okay, these data don't make sense for practical purposes and so on, but still, nevertheless, we actually get some interesting results. So what it turned out is that we're focusing on transition from noise to instability, or what's called the onset of instability. Because if you now slowly change your parameters, you now find the point where the instability kicks in. So that's essentially been the focus of the work in most of these things. So what's possibly new in doing this is we were able to actually look at the combustion stability problem, particularly the water shedding related mechanism, as essentially a flow acoustic lock-on problem, similar to the flow structure lock-on or structure acoustic lock-on, flow acoustic lock-on in cold flows. So many of those kinds of places where they have this lock-on mechanism, this is something that we also found happening in combustion instability conditions as well. Not only that, if you now actually have a equivalence ratio fluctuation that's happening along with the flow acoustic fluctuation, we could actually look for competing conditions where one of them would predominate over the other, or more interestingly, there are conditions where they will constructively or destructively interfere with each other. And so that's another thing that we were able to look at. Then we've been looking at these flame structure fluctuations and what the Germans call as technically flame flames, and I think it's accepted now in the English-speaking world. That's the right thing to say, right? So that means we're not really injecting in the plenum like what you would do in the laboratory. We are actually injecting just a little bit upstream, like it happens in practical combustors. And so let's see what happens here, where you might not really have a fully mixture at all, even when you have a swirling situation. And then we focus with some high-speed PID on intermittent burst oscillations. So these are basically pictures that show the drawings of the backward fading step combustor here. And we also, so in the previous slide, sorry, so this way basically it is for a work where we actually injected the fuel right at the coordinate step, but We also had several other cases where the injection was upstream of the step. So we had injected a year or a little bit upstream. So we had a near upstream injection or a far upstream injection, but also some of the cases where we had injection downstream into the recirculation zone. And, so this basically shows some work that we did in the middle where we actually used a V-gutter that runs along the span of the combustor with a fuel injection manifold a bit upstream, and so we could vary this distance as well, and the V-gutter shape and so on. This shows the schematic of the swirl combustor that we had. So we had a annular swirler with a central fuel injection tube and a outer mixing tube where we could actually inject fuel anywhere along this fuel injection tube at different distances upstream of the swirler, including at the swirler face as well. You will see these perforations around this, the perforated plate. That is essentially to make sure that we are looking at one shear layer dynamics at a time. So here we are essentially looking at only the shear layers caused by the swirl flow and not by any sudden expansion. So, and then we also have the perforated plate allowing for smooth flow coming in. So, with all these kinds of experiments, what's the outcome? So, how do we summarize all this? Fundamentally, we can actually look at two contrasting conditions, and this has been done in the past as well. So, for example, in the literature you would see this conditions described as what's called a smooth combustion versus rough combustion, and so on. So here, what we're talking about is fairly low amplitude excitation, which is kind of broadband. You can also see about two peaks that are having like broad bases there. Then this, when it now transitions to an instability situation, and we will show conditions where it transitions, you'll see that these are becoming very, very sharp tones, and you don't really have any further other peaks, even minor ones. So if you now look at this, just a quick look at the conditions there, the actually the airflow conditions and the mass flow rate conditions are pretty much the same. And what we've basically done is we just changed the duct line. So essentially we've got these frequencies to, the acoustic frequencies now to match closer to the water shedding frequencies for these airflow conditions to get this resonance. So how do we understand what these frequencies are? And so what we've been doing is to actually get any dominant frequency, F, to be formed as a Strovall number or a Helmholtz number. The Strovall number is essentially trying to characterize hydrodynamic instabilities, and the Helmholtz number trying to characterize acoustic modes. And so if you now have a constant Helmholtz number, you expect, with respect to Reynolds number that is, you now expect a natural acoustic mode of the duct, which was what is predominant. And so the corresponding Strovall number will vary hyperbolically. And if the Strovall number remains constant with respect to the Reynolds number, then we expect it to indicate a shear layer mode that is dominating. So in some sense, merely varying the Reynolds number systematically itself is a diagnostic. So you can actually tell which mode is dominating when, at what amplitudes and so on by doing this. So one thing that is not meant here is what happens if your Helmholtz number, neither your Helmholtz number nor your Strovall number is remaining constant. So we have those cases as well that tend to represent mixed modes, and we need to study that a little bit more. So this is, for example, some data for different fuel flow rates for one particular length of the combustor and fuel injection location and so on. So here we are basically, you look at this. This particularly will actually correspond. I didn't show the amplitude plot here, but this should typically have like a fairly high amplitude. And so this is actually representing the duct acoustic mode, but then you have a transition that happens in the dominant frequency, and then it will give rise to the dominant frequency varying increasingly with the linearly increasing trend, with Reynolds number indicating a constant Strovall number. And so we are now actually getting locking onto your vortex mode. So that was just an example, but we have like lots of data that backs this up. This is in the case of tobacco plating step with the fuel injection at the duct, so you can clearly see that different fuel flow rates just happens at different Reynolds numbers, and for this you now have this rise happening, a steep rise happening in the amplitudes corresponding to where this shift happens between a constant Helmholtz number to a constant Strovall number. So a similar kind of trend is also happening in other injection locations. For example, downstream injection, recirculation, zone injection, or downstream, all corresponding wherever you have the sudden change in the frequency trends, you have a corresponding sharp increase in amplitudes, indicating that you're locking on. And that's actually for the body flames where this thing happens, you now have a sudden increase and then it falls. Eventually, the resonance peaking in the middle of this range where this vortex mode is predominating. And that is also true for swirl combustors. I'm just showing representative data over like thousands of data sets here to show the point that I'm making. It's happening over and over again in many combustors. So how do you know that these are all vortex modes? We just see, we just look at the picture. If you have, if you look at the flame chemiluminescence data, you now see the vertical structures, which is unmistakable. This is high-speed chemiluminescence data, so we can actually look at spectra from this high-speed chemiluminescence data and then match it up with the spectra that we are obtaining from the acoustics, and then relate to the frequencies. And where there is constant swirl number, we know that it's actually, we see a vortex and then it's a vortex mode, period. So I was also talking about this competing conditions for vortex shedding and equivalent spatial fluctuations. So let me quickly elaborate that in a couple of slides. So what we find here is that we don't really have the sharp increase in amplitudes here. The amplitudes are relatively large in this set of conditions, but then they go through this up and down trend as the Reynolds number is increasing. So we thought that that's something that is pretty interesting that we wanted to look at. So we also found this in the V-gut of non-body combustors, where you see that this sudden shift in the frequencies corresponds to a rise in amplitude, all right, but as the amplitude rises, it's now going up and down. So this is actually for a distance that is a little bit greater upstream of the block body, but this is a little bit closer. You see, don't see this increasing trend. It's actually more like a constant frequency corresponding to the duct mode, and so you do see some up and down amplitudes as well. So we wanted to see what that really means. So we try to keep track of the water shedding process, the acoustic velocity at the step, the arrival of fuel pockets because of fuel injection fluctuations at the point where from the point where the fuel is injected up to the point where it reaches the step. And so essentially, what it amounts to is, you can see that a typical approach. Okay, so typically we want to say that if you have a backward creating step, the flame is going to be somewhere up there, but that's actually the nominal location of the flame. But then if you now have a vortex that's coming in and rolling up, it now tries to actually wrap the flame around like into your vortex, and then the flame gets wrapped around as the vortex now gets shed. The flame will unwrap itself out from the vortex and then get back and try to propagate upstream and then hold on at an angle, or try to hold on at an angle to the flow, depending upon the flame speed. The flame speed is fluctuating because you've got these fuel pockets that are arriving. So the question essentially is, how are the fuel pockets arriving as opposed to when the vortex is shedding? So if the flame is going to unwrap itself from the vortex and then try to come back, and that's when actually you are having a linear mixture, it's going to oppose the motion of the flame that is trying to come back. So it's going to retard this motion. And that's going to give rise to smaller flame area fluctuations and therefore heat release fluctuations and therefore a local minima in the acoustic amplitudes. As opposed to that, if you now have a flame unwrapping itself and the vortex sheds and then it comes back, and that's when you now have a mixture that's coming in with a higher flame speed. It's now going to accelerate its return, and so that's going to give rise to a larger fluctuation in the flame area and therefore heat release and a local maxima in the acoustic amplitude. And so that's the other thing that we were seeing. So let's now look at the situation where you have this upstream injection of the flame stabilization zone in a swirl combustor, where we found that you have you're now progressively increasing the distance where you're injecting this, injecting the fuel. So zero actually corresponds to injecting at the phase of the swirler. As you now go to further and further distances in millimeters, you're going upstream into the mixing tube where you're injecting the fuel and getting it to mix in the mixing tube before the mixture gets out of the swirler and goes into the recirculation zone. So the most interesting aspect of this that we found was this particular peak. So we found that unlike we would think that premixed flames are going to actually give rise to large instabilities, sure enough, yes, if you now look at like something that's more premixed, that's around, that's part of this injection upstream of the flame, it is having a fairly high amplitude level when compared to, this is not very low, so this is still around about 200 to 300 pascals or maybe 600 pascals, I think. These are all like around 500, 600 pascals, so it's not very low. But relative to that, you're having things like that are close to about 9,000 pascals when you're having a premix mixture, so showing that the premix flames are giving rise to larger instabilities. But the more interesting thing is what's happening here. When you now inject at a intermediate distance from the upstream of the swirler, you're actually having excess amplitude. So you're actually exciting more. So what's going on? Similarly, if you now look at this transition that we were talking about, so as you now have a more or less noisy, low amplitude oscillation that now begins to grow as you change your Reynolds number or any parameter that causes this, we found that the rate of growth of the rate of growth of the oscillations are actually the maximum for the intermediate injection location when compared to either closer or farther away. So this basically shows that. So the growth rate out of these oscillations. So we tried to do OH flip of this, and then this is actually phase average OH flip of injection at the swirl phase. This is injection at 50 mm upstream of the swirler, and this is injection 120 mm upstream of the swirler. And so we now try to actually do a phase averaging about these angles and look at how this works. So what we found was that this is still, even though we phase average for about 90 images, you still have lots of instantaneous, the average structure looks still close to instantaneous structures, which is quite multi-dimensional. So it is not really, and it's actually fairly low intensities as well. So when compared to what you're seeing here. But then now you look at this. So what happens is the intermediate one has structures that look more like that, and there are some events that look actually more like the premix case. So the intermediate injection location has the flame structure that is not completely mixed, and of course we had also done acetone flip to characterize what's the level of mixing because of these different intermediate locations. And sure enough, this is not as well mixed, but I think I should have shown that the acetone flip pictures. Apologize. The acetone flip does show something that's mixed very close to this. So from the acetone flip pictures, we can under cold flow conditions without the acoustic excitation, we wouldn't really say that this is not too much mixed when compared to this. So it would look like it's reasonably mixed. But here, what happens is you're not having flame structures that are flipping between what you would get over here versus what you would get over here. So there is like a fluctuation in the flame structure between something that will behave like a premix flame for some part of the cycle and something that will behave like a more like a non-premix flame for another part of the cycle. As opposed to that, if you now look at something that's reasonably well mixed because you're injecting quite upstream, you're seeing these nice vertical structures that the flame curls up into and then it gets shed and so on. That's the general picture that we have for what happens to premix flame dynamics in a swirl flow that's undergoing acoustic oscillations. So we try to quantify the whole thing by actually looking at the intensity, the total intensity of the OH flip, and then try to plot it versus the phase angle. And sure enough, we could find that the maximum intensity fluctuations were observed for the intermediate location of fuel injection, showing that you have like large flame structure oscillations that are happening, or certainly relating to heat release fluctuations there. And so finally, I want to just talk about this other, going back to the vacuum fading step combustor. We have these intermittent oscillations for fully premix. This is actually a fully premix case where the injection is happening in the phlegm itself. So we didn't want to get into any of these equivalence ratio fluctuations. And then we found that there were conditions of reasonably high amplitudes where you have these bursts. So you have some regions that are low amplitude, then it bursts, and then low amplitude again, there's a burst, there's a low amplitude and burst, and so on. So it's not exactly
periodic oscillations in any sense. So we want to see how to investigate like a region where it is growing up and then coming down, and then it is now beginning to become silent. So this is actually the end of like a large amplitude fluctuation burst, and then this is now traversing towards a quiet zone. So we now try to actually look at how this high-speed PRD is going to work out under these conditions. So the left set of images show the high-speed PRD and the corresponding high-speed chemiluminescence images, and the right side for the case where the regular oscillations are happening and then decaying down. Going back to the slide. So this set of images, and this one, the right side set of images are actually showing this set of images where the sound is getting quieter temporarily. So fundamentally, what's happening is you have a nice vortex roll-up that is beginning to be seen in the chemiluminescence data, and correspondingly we can see like one large-scale structure that's happening in the flow feed, or more or less. So this is going to actually stay over here, and then wait for the next thing to happen. So what is actually stopping this vortex is actually the small-scale vortices that are happening at the acoustic time scale. So this is actually a case where you're having a slight mismatch between the time scales of the hydrodynamics and the acoustics. And when you have a large-scale vortex structure, it's giving rise to a nice flame roll-up and large-scale flame area fluctuations relating to high-amplitude excitation. And that gives rise to nice vertical roll-up. But the moment you have this nice vortex roll-up, then in the next part of the cycle where the acoustics comes down, the vortex roll-up cannot happen anymore because the vortices are essentially being rolled up because of the acoustics. Then you have the small scale vortex roll-up that's coming up at the acoustic time scale that is interacting with the large scale roll-up. So this large scale structure is still remaining. And then straddling along with that is the small scale roll-up that is actually trying to destroy the structure of the large scale roll-up, and hence the roll-up of the flame. So the flame is no longer having a nice structure anymore that gives rise to low amplitude excitation. So this shows like interaction of two flow structures at two different time scales, one corresponding to the backward step geometrical length scale, another one corresponding to when you have the natural acoustic modes, acoustic oscillations exciting small scale vertical roll-up that interacts with the large scale. So if you now look at a POD of this, what essentially POD does is to statisticize the whole thing, right? So when you're now looking at instantaneous images, you can always say, yeah, sure, you got this, all that stuff in one particular instant, and then you could explain, but is it happening over and over again, right? So one way of actually showing that in the statistical sense is to look at the POD modes. So even though you have like a fairly unsteady flow that's going on, the POD essentially gives a statistical sense of what's the most dominant feature in the flow, regardless of the unsteadiness. And therefore, what happens is, you see that this is actually the second spatial. The first spatial mode corresponds to the mean flow. The second spatial mode essentially corresponds to like a bulk motion in the speed release zone. That's not related to the vertical structures at all. But you have the third spatial mode is something that we couldn't understand in the beginning when we started looking at the POD, until we actually looked at the high-speed sequence for that particular segment that I showed in the previous slide. Secure, we can actually see the interaction between a small-scale vortex roll-up and a large-scale vortex roll-up over there, unlike the fourth spatial mode where you see the big large-scale vortex mode. And this actually comes out with the way the temporal mode of the velocity and the chemiluminescence spectra can also be looked at from the temporal mode spectra. The spectra of the temporal modes reveal the dominant frequencies that are present. So effectively, what it means is that you're now having this kind of a small scale versus a large scale interaction predominating over the prevalence of the large scale mode itself, because the third mode has a greater energy than the fourth mode, and therefore we conclude that the interaction is the one that's causing the burst oscillations and preventing the large scale structures from prevailing all over and over again. So to summarize, what we have reported here is systematic work on all canonical plane force geometries of about this. I shouldn't even say about. It is exactly the same scale, so it's the same combustor dimensions. And what we have actually looked at is four different aspects. One is to show that combustion instability can be looked at as a flow acoustic lock-on problem with the onset of instability at the transition from noise to discrete tones because of the water shedding coupling with the acoustics. But when you now have equivalence ratio fluctuations, there are conditions that these two compete and compete for predominance, and there is an optimum upstream distance of fuel injection from the plane holder for predominance of one mechanism over the other, and then there is a disoptimum distance. They compete to have constructive or destructive interference between the two, leading to local maxima or local minima in the amplitudes that are excited. Flame structure fluctuations have been shown in this technical increments fuel injection upstream of these swirl flow and the flame is seen to fluctuate between diffusion limited and premix flame structures. And intermittent burst oscillations are essentially showing interaction between vortices of different scales, the characteristic flow time scale and the acoustic time scale. So the take-home message for the last day of this workshop here is time-resolved diagnostics and processing is key to unraveling mechanisms. So high-speed cable resistance leads to spectra that can be analyzed OH flip, using the phase average OH flip to look at the flame structure and do the high-speed PID and the POD of certain knowledge, analyze interaction of vortical structures at different time scales. So that's what I have for this morning. Thanks to you. Thank you for listening.
So you know how to create these acoustic tones and so now you also know how to stop them, right? So you have shown that there are 4 new mechanisms of noise generation, and not noise generation but instabilities. So can you in any system you can check whether it falls in any of these categories, and can you suggest ways to prevent such thing occurring?
Right. So obviously that's always the goal. Let's just take a view of what is being presented. So what we have done is to actually highlight different canonical geometries. So in reality, a typical combustor could have a combination of these canonical geometries. You will have like a pre-diffuser that actually gets into a dump diffuser, and right in the middle you have like a swirler, right? So it's kind of difficult to actually figure out which shear layers are the ones that are responding to the acoustic oscillations and are responsible for the heat release fluctuations. So how this cycle really works, right? So the answer is we now have some ways by which we can actually systematically vary conditions and look at non-dimensionalized quantities, their variations, and all the techniques that I just put together here to begin to suspect what's going on. So we can actually have an idea of what's going on. So the insights then can actually lead us to tell us, okay, what can we do in order to kill this, right? So one thing that you can see is that the longitudinal acoustic, the Helmholtz number essentially relates to the length of the duct, and the hydrodynamics actually relates to the lateral dimensions of the duct. So you have essentially the lateral and the longitudinal dimensions of the duct coming into play for the set of flow conditions that we are dealing with. And so you have these constructs whose characteristic length scales are seem to be important, so we can actually manipulate some of these things. But the answer, the bottom line is it's going to be on a case-to-case basis even now. I don't have a cure-all or panacea for instability yet. And as we keep doing things, we are finding that there are more and more mechanisms that we need to understand and that have not been studied completely. And if you now look at the international literature, there is also this move towards transverse modes that's coming up in a big way. And we are now looking into things like non-compact zones and so on. So there is a lot more to do than what we can think of. Yeah.
Satya, cases where you did this location of change for injection, is the flow fully turbulent for all the 3 cases?
Yeah, so these Reynolds numbers actually are being ranging from something like 10,000 to about 80,000.
Okay. And is there a way that you can actually measure scalar dissipation?
But yes, if you're doing high-speed stereo PIV, to some extent we can, but we ultimately may have to actually go to tomo PIV and so on. But we are going in that direction.
Sir, actually, you were saying that there is a switching over from premix to flame to diffusion flame because of the local maximum excitation from the acoustics. That can be there in a practical system. It's a possibility that whether in a diffusion dominated scenario, such things can take place.
So essentially, regardless, strictly speaking, regardless of where you're injecting your fuel, upstream of where actually the flame is, the fuel pocket, the fuel has to travel there, and then during this time it mixes with the air, right? Now, this mixing is also now influenced heavily by the acoustics that the flame excites, right? So we have to actually characterize this mixing on a cycle-to-cycle basis, or within one cycle of acoustic oscillations. So during one half of the cycle, you could have actually more mixing. Another half of the acoustic cycle, you would have poorer mixing, right? So within this distance that we have, for a given cycle, is the poorer mixing still acceptable for a premix flame when compared to the accelerated mixing, right? That's what is actually going to dictate how much the flame structure is going to fluctuate, or how this premix how this assumption of a premix flame will be violated during the cycle is what we have to understand.
But this kind of phenomenon will lead to more instability, or this will try to cure.
So what we found, yeah, that's right. So what we found was you have to actually look at the structure of partially premix flames. So you now have these flames that are actually propagating back and forth, and also having this premixing versus less premixing. You have a partially premixed flame. So there the heat release is actually getting much more localized along the leading edges when compared to along the length of the flame. So this idea of actually looking at flame area is a bit shaky. And when you now have this heat release getting concentrated at the leading edge for one part of the cycle and then gets spread out in another part of the cycle, you could have more heat release fluctuations on the whole in this region than if you simply had a pure premix flame or a diffusion flame.
You will be able to quantify this kind of phenomena because
to some extent. So
like a response function in solid propellant combustion.
Yes, of
you
course.
have a response function here.
Yes, of course. So I think pretty much in the last couple of days you would have talked about that. Right? So we can actually look for the flame transfer function.
Thank you.
Yeah, so when you are changing the location of the fuel injection, so you have found that there is some position where the pressure fluctuations are the maximum. Yes. So try to correlate that distance with so the frequency of the oscillation that you are seeing is more or less the same. Yes. For each one of them. Yes. So there is a time scale associated with that, and the speed of sound is something. So from there you get a length scale, and so how does this compare with that length scale? Maybe because when you are changing it across, then again the phase is getting in the and that is where there is an optimum phase where you are pumping in the maximum acoustic energy.
Right. So, okay. In what I showed a backward fading step combustor with an injection upstream of the step. I also showed a swirl combustor where the fuel injection was upstream of the step. And I actually looked at two different mechanisms that are caused because of this upstream injection. I think what you're talking about relates to the backward fading step, which is very more straightforward compared to what happens in the swirl flow, where you're looking at this distance, what happens actually in this distance. But this has been well propounded, so as the basis of equivalence ratio calculation. So what happens when you now have this particular distance is you have this unsteady injection of fuel that gives rise to equivalence ratio fluctuations, and these pockets of high equivalence ratio versus low equivalence ratio will travel along this distance at a convective velocity and then reach the flame. And the question that I'm talking about is, what is the flame doing due to the vortex shedding at the time when this thing arrives? So that part has now been investigated closely. So typically, you assume that the flame is kind of flat, and then it's just fluctuating back and forth, and then this is arriving. But you don't also have the vortex steady that you have to factor in. That's what I was looking for.
The spectra associated with the POD modes, we don't see a clear, strong peak as you've shown in the slides before. Why that?
Yeah. So there's always, everything is a double-edged sword. So the problem with POD is every mode is actually contaminated by all other modes to some extent. Okay. So every mode is going to say what is dominant, but it's not going to clearly show a strong peak relative to. So the other modes presence will also be there. So obviously you get the peaks as well. The POD is essentially a synthesis of all the data. So there is always a contamination. So in any mode you have contamination of all the modes present. Okay. Okay, you have second question.
You asked a question when your teacher, now it's his turn to ask.
Definitely.
So, in all these four cases, you have used different diagnostics, right? Some you use PIV, other some other places you have used PIV. So, is there any reason that you have changed the diagnostics across different frames?
No. In half an hour, we have to showcase everything that we are doing. Okay. We actually do all the diagnostics and all the cases.
Oh.
So, like I said, thank you very much.